Hi people, welcome back, how are you all? So this week I'm doing something a little bit different, and that is because I finally hit 100 subscribers. I know it's really quite small, but I'm honestly just so proud of everything I've managed on this channel so far and how far I've come, and I think it's been like about probably coming up on a year and a bit. And I'm just so grateful to like every single one of you and all the lovely comments I get and all the lovely likes and so to celebrate, I thought I'd give that whole drawing in other people's styles challenge a go. So today I'm drawing my avatar type character, firstly in my style, and then in 7 other artist styles. The reason I decided to draw my avatar and not any of my OCs is because most of my OCs at the minute belong to my comic, which means their designs are really quite simple and also medieval, which I figured wouldn't make for an overly interesting contrast, and also they don't necessarily fit as well into the other styles, although that's not true for all of them. And the one main OC I do have at the minute who doesn't belong to that set of characters is quite old and kind of not old as in elderly, but like has existed for a very long time and is probably due a major redesign at this point because I don't think his design's changed all that much since I was about 15. And so I thought this might be easier, and I also felt like my avatar could use a bit of updating anyways, so there's that. There isn't any particular rhyme or reason to the order I'm drawing these in. I started with my own style, so of course I could do the introduction over the top of it, because you guys know plenty about my regular art by now, I don't really need to talk through it. And everything else I just drew in whatever order I felt like. As for how I picked which art styles to replicate, I basically followed 3 rules. 1, they had to be a digital art style. I do occasionally do traditional art, but I figured it'd be easier to keep them all the same. 2, no lineless styles, because I am terrible at them, although there are some exceptions to this rule in the end. And 3, artists who have some kind of speed paint or video content out there somewhere for me to watch, just so I can get a better idea of how they actually make their art. In fact, I tended to just use artists that I have already been watching on YouTube. All these artists are artists I admire and follow, so, you know. The one exception to all these rules was I did give Rachel Smith's, is it Smythe's? I don't know. Rachel Smith's Olympus style a go, because I just always wanted to try that, despite the fact that it is lineless, and I don't think she's got any YouTube content that I've ever seen. But oh well. For the drawing in my own style, I very much kept it with my original process. I've been trying a couple of newer things lately, but here it just felt apt to do what I would usually do and have been doing for the last couple of months. Particularly some of the new things I've been trying have been things I've picked up off some of these artists. I also made a couple of edits to my avatar character, mostly just changing her t-shirt. In the past I've done her in more of like a hoodie and more often in a flannel shirt, because I wear a lot of flannel shirts. But I didn't want to have to make flannel pattern 8 different times in 8 different styles, and so I just went for one of my much simpler tops, in yellow, because who doesn't love yellow? For anyone who hasn't worked it out yet, my avatar is basically just me, but with blue hair and yellow shoelaces. Although, in between starting the speed paint and ending it, I did temporarily try dyeing my hair blue. It didn't work too well, because my hair is naturally a dark brown, but it wasn't bad and I quite liked it, so I'm gonna experiment a bit more with that, and maybe I will actually have the avatar blue hair at some point. So anyway, on to the rest of the speed paint. So, the first style I attempted was Oliver's Antics style, and Oliver Antics is an artist I've only just recently kind of, not discovered, I knew they existed, but just started getting into their stuff, and I really love it. They do a series with, like, character profiles where they will post something to their Instagram and let you ask a load of questions about their OCs and characters, and then talk through it in a video, which is actually the sort of thing that I'm considering maybe copying to an extent at some point. So if that's something you guys would like to see, please leave it down in the comments, because I will happily talk about my OCs for years. So there's that. But anyway, I started with their style, which in hindsight maybe might have been a bit of a mistake, as it was one of the more difficult ones, but oh well. Whilst technically the aim of this challenge is to just produce something that looks like his style, I also intended to try learn things here, so attempted sketching the same way he does, first with like a giant brush to block out the shapes, and then with like smaller marker type brushes, and then in pencil the same size as the line art. What I hadn't realised at the time was just how much detail goes into this final layer. Oliver uses line art not only to block out the shapes, but also as kind of a first layer of shading, using blocked out areas and shading lines which I had missed on the first pass. That said, this sketching process was weirdly satisfying and I really enjoyed it. I tried especially hard to get the sort of more angular look that I often see with his work, although I'm not sure if I managed it or not. Then came the tricky part. Oliver's way of colouring and shading is simply exquisite, and unlike my own, appears to show an actual understanding of anatomy and where the shadows lie. From what I could tell from watching his videos, he tends to shade the whole character on one multiply layer with a series of pink and purple colours. This is kind of new for me. I usually shade each section one at a time, so I initially tried to do it my way and do them individually in multiply layers for each section of colour. Then I took a break to watch some YouTube, and realised just how much more effort should be going into my line art, so I scrapped the shading I'd done so far, touched up the lines, and tried again on one layer. I think I had more success this time, not necessarily because it was one layer, but just because I was more conscious about where I was putting my shadows this time around. Then came the highlights. Oliver apparently uses a luminosity layer to do these, but if Clip Studio has such a layer, I couldn't find it. So I improvised a little bit and fiddled around with an add layer instead, and it seemed to work, I think. Highlights are something that I'm kind of not brilliant at myself, and so they were always going to be a bit hit and miss with these challenges, but I do think later on I start to really get the hang of it. Finally, I added an overlay layer over the entire character in different stripes of yellow, because why not? And it's something that he always does with like an overlay layer with like different stripes blended. I don't know how he picks the colours. I chose yellow because I like yellow. Now, I don't think I showed it on my own style, but I decided at some point to do little backgrounds on all of these to match the styles, given that the backgrounds are a thing I also need to work on a lot. Oliver's backgrounds tend to be one colour, and I've seen him do the little thing with the white square borders a number of times, and I also added a somewhat unnecessary gradient in the background because, honestly, I don't know when to stop. But I reckon it looks cool, and I'm really quite proud of this piece, although I will admit it's probably not the best one. So next I decided to do what I thought was going to be the really confusing and complicated one, and that was Rachel Smith's Lore Olympus style. I hardly ever do lineless art, and their style is probably one of the furthest removed from my own, except for maybe Oliver's, and that's because I've never really tried to imitate them before. Lots of the other artists on this list have really inspired pieces of my own work, or even helped teach me how to do certain things, and so my style has elements of all of them in them. But not Lore Olympus. Not because the style isn't stunning, just because it's quite different to the rest of them, and quite unique in a way. So because of that, this piece was really fun. I particularly tried to emphasise the really big eyes, as well as trying to keep the exterior line art to a minimum. As usually the artist uses different colours to show the separation, although I may still have gone a tad overboard with the lines. I'm not used to reducing them, so, you know. Speaking of colour, Lore Olympus tends to have one main colour for each character, for their skin and for their hair, and then, you know, occasionally if they're lucky, one more colour for their clothing to keep things simple. As I wanted all my drawings to be somewhat cohesive, I did keep to my own colour scheme, which I had established with my own drawing. However, I figured as an ode to that style that I was completely ignoring, I'd give my character the nymph ears that some of the characters have, instead of normal ones, just to make it clear what I was trying to recreate, despite the fact that my colour palette is way off. For the background, I decided to do a very common underworld skyline that's often in the back of some of these panels, and added an overlay to my character to make sure she fit in. At the end, I also decided I wanted to add a layer of noise to really give it that look that the artist somehow achieves. I can't really explain it, but it looks textured. But because I'd never done it before, I decided to do this off screen so you wouldn't have to watch me fiddling. For anyone who is interested though, in Clip Studio I found that it's easy to do this just by filling the top layer with any colour, and then in the filter menu go to render, Perlo noise, turn the scale way down, and then when you're done set that layer to overlay, and that seems to work pretty well. If you know an easier way, feel free to comment down below and correct my stupidity, but that's what's working for me right now. So anyway, the next style I attempted was Muzenik style, which I really hope I am saying their name right. If I'm not, I'm sorry, it'll be in the description. But yeah, Muzenik style, partly because they usually only do headshots, and I felt like a break from doing whole body drawings for a bit, and also partly just because I thought it would be fun. Now, admittedly, it wasn't until I started writing this script that I realised that they have a YouTube channel that I could have watched. Because, you see, I only follow them on Instagram, and had only seen the reels that they'd done, so I admittedly did a lot of guesswork for this piece that probably could have been avoided if I had more than 2 brain cells to rub together and had just thought to search them up before I started this to get a bit of context. But here we are. The sketching was sort of interesting here, as this artist somehow manages to really stylise their work with classic big eyes and tiny little noses, and yet they somehow retain so much of the actual shape and structure of the face in a way that makes all the characters they draw really recognisable. I do not have that talent, or at least don't have that talent to the extent that this artist does, so I sort of had to fudge this a bit around the edges. When I'm translating faces into my style, or any style I guess, I tend to pick out 1 or 2 very noticeable features on the face and focus on highlighting those, with the rest being more generalised into whatever my standard for the style is. Unfortunately for me, the noticeable feature on my face is probably my nose, and since tiny noses were the one thing that was consistent across all of this style, I wasn't really able to carry that across properly. Moving to the line art though, I once again had an example of a line art that was a substitute for a layer of shading with different opacities of line art used in different places, which was really fun to do. Once I had the block flat colours down, it also meant I got to play around with different colours of line art to see what made the most sense and made the shading look right and not really flat and grey. Still, it was on this piece that I really discovered the joy of doing proper highlights and finally started to get the hang of them. And also worked out a much faster way of shading hair than my current method. I mean, I like the way I do it at the moment, but I would definitely love to try this idea on my own work at some point, as it's so much easier. Also, future me here, I have tried this on the piece of work since then, and it's looking really good, so boom, I've learnt things. Of all the drawings I did for this series, I think this is the one that I nailed the style for best, although that is probably just because it was a headshot and I'm admittedly much better at shading skin and hair than I am at clothing, and so the style translated better. But still, it's probably one of the ones I'm most proud of. So the next one was one I was really looking forward to, and would have drawn a lot sooner in this lineup if it hadn't been that the day I decided to start drawing these, their entire channel went down, so it got postponed a little. But that is ABD Illustrates style, because honestly his art style is one of my favourite ones out there, and you can probably tell it's the most similar to mine because I just really aspire to his kind of art. I don't know how it can look so simple and yet so detailed at the same time. I will absolutely never understand it, but it's beautiful and I just love it. Surprisingly, the sketching wasn't actually too confusing for this drawing, possibly because the proportions Alex tends to use are fairly realistic as far as I can tell, and so quite similar to my own, although he usually has much better muscle definition on his characters than mine, but it's fine, I don't really have any muscle definition, so it wasn't particularly relevant. That said, the face was a little different, and whilst I really like the nose, it wasn't until I had all the colours on later that I actually grew to like the rest of the face, because it just looked a bit out of place and awkward for some reason. In terms of colours though, Alex seems to use both a mix of gradients and cell shading, although the amount of cell shading really seems to depend on the particular drawing. This was sort of the opposite of the sketching, in that I was able to get it to look really lovely on the face and the skin, but not particularly anywhere else. I think a large part of this is just that I'm not great with clothes. Alex also tends to draw much more detailed outfits than I've done here, and I think the lack of extra line art made it look too empty without more detailed shading. That said, the eyes are well cool. I don't know why drawing the pupils lighter than the irises works so well, but it does, and it looks awesome. So, the more you know. The background here was a bit of a mess, I'll be honest. I know what I was aiming for, but I'm fairly certain I didn't get it quite right. Although it turns out that I went back in post and added some chunky line art, and it made a world of difference. Alex is, I believe, the only artist on this list who I've actively tried to recreate their style before, so I'll put up a little reference of my last attempt to copy the style for you guys to see, so you can at least compare to how much better I've got at being able to copy other artists compared to about a year ago. I think it was from like June 2020. That said, it was also at this point that I suddenly remembered I have freckles, and I put freckles on the first drawing, and the second drawing, and on other ones after that. So I went back off screen and added freckles to all of those drawings, so if they look different at the end, that will be why. So next we have a favourite of mine, and honestly the artist that got me back into art over a year ago now. So in a way this artist is kind of to thank for how far I've come in the last year and a half or so. And that artist is Drawing with Waffles, who I hope won't mind me calling them Rin in this video, as that is significantly less of a tongue twister. Upon reflection, this style does sort of break my rules, as a large majority of their art is traditional and not digital, and so not exactly what I'm used to. They do have some digital stuff, and the general style is the same across both, so I figured it counted. Also, I'm making the rules, so I'm allowed to break them, so meh. Sketching in their style was quite fun actually, as their line art tends to be very casual and free, and so I didn't really have to worry about getting everything super precise as with some of the other ones with more detailed line arts. That said, I will admit that my character's hands were a bit of a disaster here, which is ironic because I believe it was Rin who taught me the neat little trick of drawing the middle two fingers as one just big chubby finger and then splitting into two, which is something I've been using for ages now. To give it that more traditional look, I decided to use a textured line art pen for this drawing, compared to the previous ones. However, colour was a little bit more difficult, as the amount of detail Rin puts into the shading of her drawings varies wildly depending upon the piece, as with a lot of these. Many are just flat colours with coloured line art and the odd little gradient, whereas some of the others are much more rendered. I couldn't resist adding the little highlights to the edge of the mouth and the nose, because this is something I don't specifically remember copying off Rin, but it's certainly something I've been doing for a while. But as usual when it came to the clothes, I got myself in a bit of a muddle. I think the biggest lesson I've learnt from all of these drawings so far is that I really need to do some studies of clothes and clothing patterns after all this. But oh well, that's a problem for tomorrow. I also took plenty of inspiration from the reference of the girl in the cap that you should be able to see on the screen, as I noticed the drawing had like an overlay of the sketch on top of it, and I thought that this sort of controlled messiness looked really awesome, so I copied that and the gradient background for a nice simple background that wasn't going to take me too much effort. My next artist is Caezhel, whose name I am certainly pronouncing wrong, so I'll make sure to also have that one written in the description, along with everybody else, so you actually have an outside chance of finding them. They're an artist that I kind of started watching on YouTube around the time I was beginning to work on my comic as a story idea and starting to hit roadblocks with the whole actually drawing stuff part of it. They have one of the most beautiful styles I've seen basically ever. Even more so because they somehow use this incredibly detailed style for their webcomic Lucky, and it looks absolutely fantastic. If you want a reference for how detailed and difficult this is, then know that this is the only painting in this entire set where I felt the need to actually check what my own face looked like for more than a quick cursory glance. It's just so pretty. As you know, I've always had a couple of comic ideas floating around in my head, and the ones that I've put on hold for a while is because I knew I wanted to be able to produce something closer to this kind of quality if I ever did write it. Because of that, I can admit that my sketch is not perfect, and I reckon my art will need to improve a lot more before I can properly imitate this artist at all, because they're just... I mean, look at it. You can see the references. Just look at that. That said, after I had battled through the sketch came the line art. The style itself is surprisingly line art heavy, which actually makes sense for a comic where you want to avoid unnecessary levels of shading. And that meant that, like Oliver's style, I needed to get in loads of extra details that I usually don't bother with. But I think I was more aware of it this time, and actually the way they line the hair of their characters is really similar to how I've done mine before. So that gave me a nice break and just got to do something that I know how to do and I'm comfortable with and I really enjoy. I'm sure I've mentioned before, but doing the hair is one of my favourite bits of my own style, and so it was just a nice little break there. However, the pen I decided to use for this is one I haven't touched in a while, and I completely forgot that I'd modified it to change size when tilted, and so watch me battle super crazy thick lines as I started to get lazy and tired at the end of this drawing, and not remember how to go into the settings to change it back. I also had the usual struggle here of hopelessly trying to get my hair to be the same length on both sides of my head, which is, you know, it sort of got there in the end, maybe. The colours were another interesting section on this, as I'm sure you can see from the reference images. Caezhel mostly uses quite dim lighting to contrast against quite bright highlights, but I wanted this image to be able to fit with the rest of the ones I'd done, and so I felt it was best to stick with my own colour scheme first, and then edit it with multiply layers and such at the end to get it to more closely resemble their style. Of these sections, the hardest part was, in fact, the highlights. You guys have probably worked out by now that I'm never really sure what to do with them, particularly as on the references they had a sort of rough edge to them, which made me think they were using like a fancy brush that I don't have. Still, I did my best to imitate with some of the pencil features and a rough eraser, and after much back and forth, I finally got there. I also did a background, just a classic dark gradienty background with like cool glowy line things. You can see what I was going for if I was trying to imitate some of the ones in the examples. There wasn't really much logic to it other than glowy lines. But you know, that's cool, right? Right? So my final artist was Nadiaxel, who, if I'm being honest, is someone I've tried to imitate a ton over the years, especially in the hair department. Like everyone else on this list, their art is just absolutely stunning, and I was very aware going into this that I was never going to get it perfect. The sketching was not actually as difficult as I expected it to be. Maybe because the detail is more in the shading for this one than in the line art, or maybe just because I've gotten so much practice recently trying all these different styles that my art has somehow genuinely improved in the course of the 8 drawings. That said, I did spend a considerable amount of time working on the eyes. Nadia always draws such big eyes with so much detail in them, and I was struggling to make them look large and glamorous as opposed to messy and kind of bug-eyed. But I think I sort of got it after a while, and I think particularly once the colours went on, they looked a lot better. Like I said, the line art is less important here compared to the shading, but there are still a couple of areas where it made a huge difference, in particular around the eyes and the hair. The line art on the hair, I also realised, is usually coloured, so I added that too, although I wish I'd noticed in time to draw it on a separate layer. But you live and you learn. I got there, it just took a while. The trickiest bit was, of course, the colour. Unlike every other artist on here, Nadia doesn't appear to shade using multiply layers, or at least not only multiply layers, which meant I had to try something new here, mostly using the select tool and an airbrush to try get the right effect, which is something I've never done before. I've always just shaded straight with the oil brush onto my drawings, and I've been avoiding the airbrush because I was told it's a very easy way to make your drawings look kind of amateurish, but with the select tool, I think it made a difference. I did use a regular brush to even things out in a couple places, but for the skin and the clothes, it was mostly just this one method, and I'm super proud of how it turned out. I once again suffered the highlight problem here, not so much on the clothes and on the face, as I kind of had more specific references for that, but on the hair, I'll admit, I tried doing it with lines first, then I tried blending them out a bit, and it looks a little bit sloppy, I will be honest, but from a distance, if you squint a bit, I think it looks pretty great. A lot of Nadia's drawings, or at least the ones that I was looking at, do appear to just have plain white backgrounds. Now, I kind of thought this was cheating slightly, so I did a very subtle gradient, but I didn't really do much for background here. Looking through their art now, though, there are a number that do have more detailed things, but they are more the exception than the rule, so I'm kind of glad I kept things the way they were. Overall, I think this is my favourite piece in the entire set, just because I expected it to be one that I would never quite get there with, and whilst, you know, like I said, the highlights could be better, I think this was one of the ones that got closest to the style, which, given how, you know, difficult and complicated and beautiful the style is, I'm really proud of that. And so, congratulations! You made it to the end of the video. I made it to the end of recording these voiceovers, which, to be honest, I love talking about my art, but I'm super self-conscious about doing the voiceovers because I live in a house with other human beings, namely my family. I don't want them to judge me too much. But yeah, you made it to the end. If you actually watched the whole video, you are awesome, well done, and I'm going to pose a question to you, which is that next week's video, I'm doing some fan art of the characters that I've done like a million times already. You can probably guess who they are if you just take a quick look through things I've drawn a lot. And so was wondering if you had anything you wanted me to talk about during that video. If not, I'm probably just going to leave it as like a quiet one, like I might introduce it quickly, but I'll not have a voiceover for it just because I don't have anything more to say about those two characters other than I love them. But if you've got any ideas of things you'd like me to talk about at all, please leave that down in the comments. And also please comment what you thought of this video. Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Did you think I did a decent job at emulating these styles? Obviously, if somehow any of the artists mentioned here have ever seen this video, you're all amazing. I think you're all absolutely brilliant. I love your art. Thank you for inspiring me. Keep doing what you're doing. You're brilliant. I mean, I think I've got to say my favourites of this section of drawings were Muzenik, the ABD Illustrates one, and Nadiaxel are probably the best ones, but I've learnt so much from all of them, and I just really enjoy doing this. But that's everything I have to say, so thank you for watching. Please leave a like and maybe a comment if you have time, and thanks again. I will see you all next week.